Congressman James Clyburn, the third-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, told Brian Kilmeade and me last week on our Brian and the Judge radio show that the Congress simply does not care about whether its behavior is constitutional. Quote, most of the stuff we do is not authorized by the Constitution. That's what he told me when I asked him point blank about where in the Constitution the federal government is authorized to regulate health care. This reveals a common misunderstanding, often intentional, I think, about the big government types in both parties in Washington, D.C. They simply do not recognize that the federal government is one of limited powers, and the Congress does not sit in order to right every wrong. Regrettably, the Congress thinks it can write any laws it wants and recognizes no limitations on its own power, notwithstanding the history, the values, and the words of the document all members of Congress have sworn to uphold, to protect, and to defend. You can read my entire op-ed on this topic in Tuesday's Wall Street Journal. Joining me now is Lou Rockwell, chairman of the Mises Institute and former editor of Private Practice, a journal of socioeconomic medicine. Lou, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Judge, great to be with you.
Thank you. I just heard the president talk about the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, which he wants to regulate banks and which he hopes to install somewhere inside the Federal Reserve. What will it take for this administration to learn the lessons of the past? Can you imagine what will happen if the Fed has more power to regulate more private activity than it already has today?
Well, Judge, you're looking at things from the standpoint of the American people or the standpoint of the consumer. But Mr. Obama and the rest of those guys in Washington are looking at things from the standpoint of the government. So this is very good for the Fed. It's good for the government. It's good for the big banks. It's going to enrich them, empower them at the expense of the American people. In other words, it's business as usual in Washington.
Well, the president was pretty much taking credit this morning, or this afternoon, Lou, when he spoke at Wall Street for TARP, which he voted in favor of as a senator, for President Bush's stimulus, and, of course, for his own stimulus. Together, these two projects cost close to $2 trillion. So let's see. They let Lehman Brothers fail. They saved AIG. They turned General Motors over to the government and to the unions. And he's taking credit for this as if this is something that's good, as if there won't be a price to pay the piper at some point in the future.
And, of course, as you mentioned the Federal Reserve before, we don't know exactly how much new money the Federal Reserve created and spent on the big banks, but it's perhaps $11 trillion. So we don't know how much they've spent. $13 trillion, 14 quazillion. I guess we'll have to make up new numbers. But again, this is something that's good for the Fed, it's good for the government, it's good for Obama, it's just bad for us Americans.
Well, what do you think is our best hope here? I spoke to about 25,000 people in Fort Worth, Texas over the weekend. And after quoting Thomas Jefferson, the biggest applause lines I would get is when I would attack both parties as being complicit in the big government robbery of our liberties. How much more liberty can we afford to lose? How many more speeches have to be given? What has to happen before people realize that the big government crowd in D.C. will try to steal our natural liberties?
Well, Judge, I was struck by something in the New York Times, of all publications, when they said the Republican leaders didn't want to have any participation in any of these demonstrations because they were concerned about the hostility towards politicians of both parties. So I think that's right. I think more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that neither party, if Joe Wilson had been honest, he would have said, we all lie.
Right.
They all lie.
Right.
So I think that we have to not put our faith in the government, not put our faith in Washington, D.C., and we have to do things on our own, and we have to, in my view, withdraw our consent from the government. We can't go along with what they're doing with health care or all the rest of the other expansions of federal power if we want to have any kind of a society left to hand on to our children and our grandchildren.
I did get a little bit of good news, and it may have been from reading LouRockwell.com. Did I read that the bill to audit the Fed in the Senate already has 25 co-sponsors? Do I have that right?
Yeah, no, that's true, and there's huge interest. I must say, for the first time in my lifetime, and this is thanks to Ron Paul and also, of course, thanks to the Federal Reserve recession they put us into, that for the first time ever, average Americans are concerned about this central bank. They know it's not just a name on a bill in their pocket, but rather it's the great counterfeiting agency, the agency that brings on recessions and depressions, that threatens us now with hyperinflation, thanks to Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Greenspan. And so I think they're worried in Washington about people not obeying them, not paying attention to them, not worshiping them. And this is, I think, what we have. One good step, if people are interested in this, read Ron Paul's new book called End the Fed.
Right.
It's quite an amazing tour de force.
Lou Rockwell, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.